Okay, here we are with another 5 sheet today. Remember, everybody, the 5 sheet is a free open source tool anybody can use to cut through the disinformation you see in a lot of these news articles. Because today, the news is not as newsworthy as it used to be. Us regular citizens have to use a little bit of investigative work to read through these news articles, to cut through all the manipulative tactics they use to get the actual information we want. And this is a good little cheat sheet to help us find what it is we're looking for. So today we have a New York Times article, and we'll start out with the headline as they write it. Extremists emboldened by Capitol attack pose rising threat, Homeland Security says. So that is a fact. There is not much editorialization there. They're summarizing a quote from this bulletin that they'll talk about down there. They have this little subtitle down there. There's more editorialization in this. The warning was a notable departure from a Department of Homeland Security accused of being reluctant during the Trump administration to publish intelligence reports or public warnings about the dangers posed by extremists and white supremacist groups. So if we were doing that part, maybe that would be opinion, but looking at the main title, I put that as a fact. Keep in mind this 5 sheet is just filled out according to my own opinions and biases. So if you were to fill it out, you might fill it out differently. That's fine. It's an open source tool. Anyone can use it how they see fit. That's what makes it so powerful. So, how did I paraphrase that title? DHS says that extremists who are emboldened by the storming of the Capitol pose a rising threat. Alright, right off the bat, this is just sending chills down my spine for reasons we're going to get into shortly. I don't like, Patriot Act in the first place was a terrible idea. And the fact that we're expanding its usage, aiming it inward, is not a good idea. We're going to see how this is just a sales document for that proposition. So, what's the bias of the New York Times? I put it as establishment left, meaning it's not right wing, but it's not like a true progressive. It's a sort of corporatist Democrat. They'll support Wall Street, they'll support war, and as is particularly relevant in this article, they'll agree with anything coming out of the intelligence agencies. Like in the lead up to the Iraq War, when they said Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, that's not the type of thing they would have questioned. They would have just printed that as, with the same factual implications as we're going to see in this article. Okay. Next, we're moving on to the thesis. It comes right in this first paragraph. Warning that the deadly rampage at the Capitol this month may not be an isolated episode, the Department of Homeland Security on Wednesday said publicly for the first time that the U.S. faced a growing threat from violent domestic extremists emboldened by the attack. Again, I put that as a fact. Not much editorialization there. Mostly just relaying what the DHS said, what the intelligence agencies told them. How did I paraphrase it? The DHS said publicly, for the first time, that, quote, violent domestic extremists are a growing threat and may have been emboldened by the storming of the Capitol. Alright, so what evidence do they have supporting that? They have a few quotes from the advisory bulletin, this National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin. They talk about how it made specific references to the storming of the Capitol, and the Walmart shooting last year. And the last thing was this here, where an anonymous, well, they just describe him as an intelligence official involved in drafting the bulletin. So, it's an anonymous source, and they get a little context for the bulletin from that. So that's the evidence they have. But again, it's not really a controversial thesis. They're basically just reciting what was printed by the intelligence agencies. So you don't need a lot of evidence to back up when you're just copy and pasting what the intelligence agencies printed. All right, what's the outline? Start out with that thesis at the beginning, and then some stuff about what drove the bulletin. So talk about perceived grievances fueled by false narratives. DHS is concerned these same drivers will remain in place. Goes through that for a while. Then it talks about the history of the Trump administration and domestic terror, about how Trump, the way they're characterizing it was how the Trump administration was pushing back on labeling, on the labels of domestic terrorism, how he seemed reluctant to expand the Patriot Act to be used against American citizens. And then it talks about the specifics of what are in the bulletin, and then they get into the real sales pitch part in these last few paragraphs. Why it's such a good idea that we should see everyday Americans as the real terrorists. Okay, so now we're going to get down into the named manipulation tactics. So this is the part where I've identified these tactics here, which are the most common things you see in these printed news articles that are just manipulative tactics the writers use to either push an agenda or to drive clicks or to do anything other than convey the news. And really, the only one I had here was straw man feigning ignorance, and there are a lot of them. So, I've grouped straw man feigning ignorance as one thing because it can be hard to separate the two. Straw man is where you choose the weakest argument the other side has and argue against that. And feigning ignorance is where you omit material facts from the argument and act as if they weren't part. And the two can get too closely intertwined. So mostly treat them as one thing. All right, first one here. This came pretty early up here. See if we can find it. So, the presidential transition, as well as other perceived grievances fueled by false narratives. That was a quote from the bulletin. And then the writers of this article say, a clear reference to the accusations made by Trump and echoed by far right-wing groups that the election was stolen. I don't know if that was a clear reference. They didn't mention QAnon. That's another false narrative that the right-wing far nationalists are always, that, people always accuse them of. COVID conspiracies, 5G conspiracies, any sort of... There are a lot of false narratives on that side, and some of them even get mentioned later on in this article. But here at the top, they just say that it's clearly talking about the election. So, that's a little bit dishonest. Next one here. This is just a classic. You see this come up all the time. The very fine people on both sides. For people who don't know, that's just completely false. In the same sentence, Trump said that white nationalists and neo-Nazis should be condemned totally. So when they're saying that Trump was was, referring to white nationalists as very fine people. So, yeah, let's see exactly how they said it. He played down any danger posed by extremist groups by referring to very fine people on both sides. But he also said that white nationalists and neo Nazis should be condemned totally. The very fine people on both sides were both sides of the debate about whether whether or not we should be removing Confederate statues and monuments. So that's an old one, but it comes up continually. They implied a few points throughout the article that Trump pushed back on intelligence agencies who are trying to expand the Patriot Act, trying to aim it inward at U.S. citizens, because he supports those white nationalists. Now, what they don't mention is if you watch independent media, you'll often see the narrative that Trump had been battling with the intelligence agencies throughout his administration, seeking to limit their power. A lot of the attacks on Trump came from within the intelligence agencies that were, technically under his control, allegedly within his control. A lot of these leaks coming out that led to the Russia probe were from these intelligence agencies. So if you are aware of that narrative, which is not mentioned anywhere in this article, it would follow that he would seek to limit their power to use extrajudicial powers on U.S. citizens. Right? If his whole administration, he's battling with these intelligence agencies and they're trying to ramp up their power, they're trying to get more authority to go after people, to go after citizens using Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay type powers. It would make sense that he's just trying to push back on that as part of the power struggle that had been happening throughout the administration. And they don't mention that possibility, that side of the argument. They just imply that it's because there were white nationalists on that side, and Trump is a fan of the white nationalists. So that is another. That's not a straw man, that's a feigning ignorance. They're just ignoring, they're pretending that that argument doesn't exist. They're not arguing against a weaker argument, they're just not arguing against it at all. Alright, so let's move on to this final section here, where we just talk about the bigger picture stuff. What do we think the article was trying to convey? What other tactics might have been going on here? I think the main thing to take away from this story is that it's completely one-sided. The writers are just repeating the talking points of the intelligence agencies without question. Proper journalism would try to consider all relevant sides of a story to give context, especially one with something as important as turning the Patriot Act on everyday Americans. This is the same type of journalism we saw in the lead up to the Iraq War, where all you see is, oh, the intelligence agencies say Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. It's a slam dunk was the term they used, with how certain they were that he had those weapons. And there was no investigative journalism, there was no one really snooping around from these big institutional newspapers, from the media outlets that have the power to really get in there, snoop around, and ask those questions. There was no attempt made to do that. They just have their contacts with the intelligence agencies, and they just write down what those guys say. And even worse, this one, it just writes down what they say, and then they use all their skills to best sell them to the general public. Right? This whole section at the bottom. The watchful public will always be the best eyes and ears for law enforcement. Uh, so, wait, here, in my view, it is domestic terrorism mounted by right-wing extremists and neo-Nazi groups. We have to be candid and face what the real risk is. So that was a quote by one of these, and that's a former intelligence agency guy. And then just the writers of the article, this is just their editorial opinion. Such candor has long been an exception. They're like, wow, finally this guy is being honest with us. So, yeah, there's just this whole point about just selling it. They're not. It goes beyond just regurgitating the talking points they're being given. They're really trying to shine those talking points up and use all of their journalistic institutional powers to get people to believe those talking points. A couple other small notes here. They had this quote: his consistent message was that it was the so-called radical left that was to blame for the violence and destruction that has punctuated the demonstrations. That was talking about all of the BLM riots throughout the summer. And I don't know if that's something that's widely disputed. I thought most people agreed that, it was Antifa and BLM that were burning down the stores and causing all the violence there. But I don't know, maybe there's another side of that story. They didn't present it here. But there you go. Hey, I just noticed this at the bottom. Mike Baker contributed reporting. Boo boo boo. Mike Baker, I think, is that guy who's a former CIA agent. Right? You see him doing interviews. Alright, well, that's interesting to note. And then there's, some amount of just general fear-mongering in here about how scary it is that we have all these terrorists running around. Any one of your neighbors, any person you're at the grocery store with, he might be an actual terrorist. You have to be the eyes and the ears of law enforcement. You have to start getting ready to call the police. Even your own family might be. There's a little bit of that language ramping it up. So, yeah, this was a really scary piece in my mind, because it's this powerful organization, the New York Times, throwing all their resources behind selling this message that, the Patriot Act is all well and good, but it didn't go far enough. We need to be able to start sending people to Guantanamo Bay, not just if they're, foreign terrorists. We need to be able to start taking anyone with differing political views and shipping them out without due process, without any kind of trial, without any date for when they might leave. We need to bypass the judiciary and start ramping up these terrorism type mechanisms for our own domestic problems. And this narrative we've been seeing come out the past few weeks, but they're really pushing hard to sell it with this article. So keep your eyes out for this. Hopefully this doesn't go too far, but maybe it will. Alright guys, let me know if you think I made any mistakes. You can drop a comment below. And if you see a different article you'd like me to run a 5-sheet on, feel free to make that suggestion as well. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.